So much, Katie. You know, I knew exactly what I was going to say. However, Scott took my whole line, so the lecture is down. This is an aerial view. This is the garden. This is the house. This is the new wings. These are very neatly parked cars. But seriously, this aerial, I just put this in at the last minute from Google Earth, but it really gives an incredible amount of information. And the more I sat there staring at it, the more I realized that 120 years after the completion of this house and garden, 119 years after the completion of this house and garden, the original structure that was established 120 years ago still very much shapes the site. The formal garden's a movable tent that's amazing Google Earth caught on that day, and cars that are too compulsively parked. And I need to do some housekeeping because I don't know where I put my remote. This is a very informal talk. If you have a question, please feel free to ask it or wait till after, whatever. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about the home, the garden, the history, because historic photographs really enrich your whole understanding of it. And then we'll go out in the garden. I'm going to speak from the terrace, a couple points on the terrace. Then I will, for those who want to, afterwards I'm glad to go into the garden and answer questions about the design and the structure. For those of us who are of a certain age for Saginaw, this has been a museum since 1947, and I don't remember when it opened. I'm not quite of that certain enough age, but this has been a museum far longer than it ever was a private home. It was completed in 1905, 1906, and it was a home a private home until 1947. So for roughly 4 decades, it was a private home. And I didn't do my math before I got up here, and I won't get my calculator out, but subtract 1947 from 1924. And it was the home of the Ring family. Lizzie Merrill Palmer Ring, Clark Lombard Ring, their son Thomas, their daughter Elizabeth, and their Mrs. Garrett. I always usually say Mrs. Palmer and Mrs. Garrett. It really was their private home, and it also figures into the history of Saginaw, and very much so that whole lumbering period. How many of you are familiar with Saginaw's lumbering history? And, if we were here 140 years ago, we would know this as Saginaw as the lumber capital of the world. This is a scene right behind City Hall. The Ring's parents came with their children to Saginaw. So Eleazar Ring arrived in the 1860s, and Thomas Merrill, that's Mrs. Ring's father, arrived in Saginaw, and they were involved in lumbering. And this is not a conversation or a presentation on the history of lumbering. We have a gallery devoted to that at the museum. But being involved in lumbering doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sawmill, although both the Rings and the Merrills did. It also had to do with having timberlands, and it was one type of lumber that made Saginaw prosper. It was white pine, which really grew in the areas surrounding Saginaw, not really in the city of Saginaw or in the immediately surrounding area, but it was northwest and east of here that there were the great stands of pine land that could then be transported into Saginaw along the river, using the rivers as transportation. And both the Ring family and the Merrill families had sawmills, had timberlands, and really prospered with the community and reinvested in the community they lived in. This isn't a rags to riches story. This is really two families that came to Saginaw, especially the Merrills, with resources and really grew those resources and really became very important parts of the community in which they lived. And since we're talking about a home here, sometimes it's a good idea to see your childhood home. This is the house we're in right now, or just outside of, because the house is immediately to the north of here. But this is the Merrill home. That's where Mrs. Ring grew up, and that was on South Michigan, about a little over a mile south of here. The other house, the Ring home, Eleazar Ring's home, actually stood exactly roughly on the same piece of property where the house that's now the Saginaw Art Museum stood. It was a very substantial Italianate mansion, and I'm sorry I don't have better photographs of it, but you'll have to take my word for it, but where I'm pointing is the tower. It was an Italian villa-style home with a tower on it, a wooden fence. So this would be roughly where we're standing right now. This is where the home stood that Mr. Ring grew up in. And just to give you a little bit more idea of what it was like, it was a little bit north of the house we're at today, and then it had, with the same parcel of property, it had a gazebo, barns, and one of the things about the site you might notice, when you look at the aerial photograph of it, you might notice there's railroad tracks and industry in the back of it. That was the case when Clark Lombard Ring was growing up in his father's home. That was the case when they commissioned Charles Adams Platt to design their new home in 1904. Saginaw really was a bustling, thriving city, and it was really very mixed between business and residential and housing scales. You can still sense that today, but if you would have been here a century ago, you really would have sensed it. But you can see Hamilton Street actually never went through, although there's a right-of-way. You can see the Michigan Central Railroad that goes through. You can see in the back, this is just before this house was constructed. You can see where there's some type of business. Bristol Street is roughly the modern Remington. This is what behind the house would have looked like in a flood. Saginaw did flood frequently, and it was on lowland. If you've got rivers bringing logs in, there's a kind of a downside to river systems, that in times when there's a lot of water, you can have flooding. So we would be immediately to the north of here. Michigan Avenue is up where my hand is, but it gives you an idea of the type of business and what the area in the backyard would have felt like. And this is actually the garden that stood on this site before this garden stood here. It was probably, quite a bit of it was probably developed by Lizzie Merrill and Clark Lombard Ring. However, it probably was started by Eleazar Ring. So if this was 120 some years, 30 years ago, we would probably be sitting in about the kitchen of that house next door. It's really kind of an enchanting landscape, but it's very different than the garden they would develop. One of the things, if you look carefully, that's on the site, there's some apple trees. This is the house that was demolished to make way for this house. And you can just really kind of sense the mixture of plantings and stuff that are there. So one of the things I wanted, a person that's really pivotal to this story is Charles Adams Platt. Charles Adams Platt, who's heard of Charles Adams Platt? Okay. Charles Adams Platt is a highly regarded landscape architect. His training was as an artist. He was born about in the 1860s, just as both of the Rings were. Studied in New York and Paris as an artist and trained as an artist. This is a painting he did of his studio. And it's in Paris, the painting. But what he really became noted for was his etching, and this is one of his etchings, and these were highly regarded in the 19th century, as they are still today. The museum, Saginaw Art Museum, has a large collection of his etchings, and this may seem kind of odd that somebody's training is in painting and etching, but not in landscape architecture or designing buildings. Does that strike? And yet what he's remembered for and is known for is as a landscape architect and a designer of buildings. Does that seem odd to anyone? Okay. It just, sometimes people are shocked that there wasn't a formal training period went through. So Platt and his brother, and I'm going to keep this kind of short, his brother was working in Frederick Law Olmsted's office in New York, and Platt felt that his brother needed more exposures and to other forms of landscape architecture. And they went on a trip to Europe, a trip to Italy, to take photographs and study Italian Renaissance gardens. And the idea was that they would publish an article or a book. Platt's brother drowned when they returned to the United States, and Platt, however, continued with the project, wrote an article for for the Century magazine, I believe it is. And then he went forward and he published the book called Italian Gardens, which became a very important book in the 19th century. It was illustrated with his photographs, and at the same time, Platt was summering in Cornish, New Hampshire, where Auguste St. Gaudens had a summer home, and there was kind of a real interest in gardening. And at this time, Platt started to develop his own garden using some of the techniques he had seen in Italian gardens. So this is Platt's garden in Cornish, New Hampshire, with his own summer home. And I'm going to jump here to the Ring family, or the Merrill family, and we don't know precisely why the Ring selected Charles Adams Platt. We have a lot of reasons why we suspect they did. The Platts the Rings knew a number of people in Detroit, including Charles Lang Freer, who was already in contact with Platt and brought him to Detroit. But also Mrs. Ring's family, were very involved very interested in the arts. Her brother Thomas, who was born in Saginaw and had taken the lumber business out to the West Coast and to Minnesota, would commission Auguste Rodin to work from Auguste Rodin. So I mean, the idea that they would hire a major architect to design a home is not unusual. It's not totally unexpected. However, what we do know is the Rings, about 1904, decided to hire Charles Adams Platt to design a home. And Platt, by that time, had drifted into designing gardens and homes in Cornish, New Hampshire. He had done a few homes. He wasn't the prominent figure that he would become. And this was really one of his first major commissions outside of the East Coast. So it was in 1904 that we know the Ring family commissioned Platt to design the home. And at that time where Platt started, and he probably came to Saginaw, we aren't positive he did, but he was given this survey of the site. And this is the site of the home that existed here before this house was constructed. And Platt did totally rework the site, as you can see. However, he didn't remove everything. One of the things he did is work around an existing orchard. You can see the apple trees here. They've been replanted, but there were mature apple trees that were on what would become a terrace. It's not a terrace yet. There's a couple out in the garden itself. And from what has been preserved, we know that that Platt designed several possible layouts for the property, and this is the one that is closest to what was constructed. It places the house with the long main cross axis going north and south, with a central axis going through the property. So just to give you an idea, this is the garden that was here before. And this would be the house that stood right where we're sitting now, where this wing is. It was a very tight urban lot. Actually, at Mr. Ring's funeral, the minister said that he and his wife had developed gardens that were a joy to the family and to their many friends throughout their lives on a most uninspiring site sloping down to a railroad track. So you can see how close their neighbors were. This is the Vincent family. Mrs. Vincent was Arthur Hill's, after the school is named in Hill Auditorium at the University of Michigan. This is his residence. Both houses were shoehorned on this small site, and then the Rings property was next door. And this is the rendering of the front facade of the house that Platt designed, which is still very recognizable today. And I thought this might be a time to mention from Italian Gardens. It will be seen that this is a quote description of how Platt thought Italian gardens really, his description of an Italian garden. It will be seen that in the Villa Lante, the main features of the Italian villa to be found in much of their original perfection, namely the house, the flower garden, the terrace, the grove, the fountain, and the water feature. And a general study of the villa will show that their different dispositions are the result of harmoniously combining those different parts with the natural formation of the land. And then he goes on to say if any prominence is given. But as we look at this, and when we go outside to the garden, think of how that is designed, how that really relates to the design that he would develop on this site. So I'm just going to kind of briefly go through the house and out into the garden. So if you would have been here in 1911, this is what you would have seen. Platt really designed the entire home and then selected the furnishings for the client. So he both designed the house, selected the finishes within the home, and then selected the furnishings for his clients. And unlike his contemporary Frank Lloyd Wright, who said, when my clients move in and can't afford the furniture I've designed, it becomes painful, Platt really made certain he had clients with an adequate budget, but also worked with them closely. So you can see that most of the furniture probably was with Platt. The colors would have been selected to blend throughout the house and garden. So originally the ceilings were a tawny kind of ochre color. Those were reflected with the concrete was treated with a wash outside. The same shade of white was used inside and outside. And there's actually some of the flowers from the color where we know the original colors. I know the dining room chairs originally had a crimson velvet upholstery. There was a lot of crimson flowers used in the garden. So it really was designed so that the color scheme would go along, but then the house and garden were designed as one unit, and we'll look at that more when we go along. So the main axis carries all the way through the property. So if you entered the front door, you could, I know in feng shui, you're not supposed to always have the front door open into a window. But I mean, you could have gone, you could see right out into the garden where the exidra is in the back, and everything in the small fountain is. So everything's repeated. There were minor axes started in the dining room and the drawing room, and those continue through the garden. He really incorporates the apple trees even as we look in the garden. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to remind you that this was a family home for 40 years. This is the Garrett wedding in, I think it's 1911, and you can see they're in the dining room, and one of the things that the newspaper notes in the description that the wedding feast was a Roman banquet, and that guests were, and they comment that the tables were dressed with linens and silver that had been collected by the family in their travels in Europe. This is the south porch, which you would have came through, which interestingly enough was originally open. I'll talk about that in a moment. If we went upstairs, of course, if you were visiting in 1911 and you weren't a house guest, you wouldn't have gone upstairs. But you'll have to take my word for this. But I know when you look at the actual photograph, you can see this is Mrs. Ring's bedroom, which would have been on the second floor. If you look back at the house, it's the room with the 3 French doors leading to the iron balcony. One of those was for her dressing and bathroom. The other 2 were in her bedroom. But above the beds, the photographs in the bedrooms are photographs from Platt's Italian Gardens. The one above Mrs. Ring's bed is for the Villa Pamphili, and excuse my pronunciation of that. However, why would you look at a photograph of a garden when you could look out your window, and this would have been the view of the garden from her window. And this photograph was probably taken in 1911 probably about 1912 or probably the summer of 1912, we believe. One of the things I wanted to point out are the apple trees, which Platt incorporates, just as he did in his own garden in Connecticut. And this is the Ring Garden. So this is Platt's garden in Cornish, New Hampshire. This is the Rings Garden. And notice that the apple trees the house is positioned to take advantage of the canopy formed by the apple trees. Just again, the urban site. So this is this is the 1904 Platt designed home. This is later one. This is a Barry Faulkner watercolor of the garden. I think that was done in 1913. One of the things you'll see, if you notice from the photographs, that there is The view isn't really that good, is it, from if you're in the house? But what Platt did was took advantage of a row of willows that Mr. Ring's father had planted that were 52 feet tall at the time the house was constructed, the things you learn from a survey. And they were actually kept high pruned, so they were a flat horizon line. I mean, this is about controlling nature, not working with it to a degree. This is the earliest photograph of the garden. The house was included in Herman Mutasius's Landscape and Garden. And in this you can see the apple trees. The porch is open, the south porch, and this is the breakfast room. The cross axis of the garden with the peonies and looking back at the house. And you can see how the structure of the garden relates to the house and the two work together. The plantings in the garden were very carefully selected. Platt was an avid gardener, and his wife was an avid gardener. He probably wasn't any better of a gardener than I am. So he did rely upon consultants. In this case, the consultants he used were Breton Hall of Boston, who helped develop the original planting list and was later refined by other ones. The property was fenced in using wooden fences, and it's interesting that there's several different iterations of there's a couple different versions of the fencing that are designed originally proposed using brick walls. However, before the house was constructed, they had changed to wood. How appropriate for a family that made their money through lumbering. This would be looking north towards where the vision area is today. In case if you think that this garden, he was not working with a blank slate. And it's fun to think that where the cross-axis in the garden is purely based on some mathematical principle for a perfect proportion. It actually is positioned to hide the hills or the Vincent's garage, which was immediately behind it. So that if we were standing in the garden looking at the pavilion, originally the Hills garage was visible behind there. Looking towards the Toole house, looking from these are Barry Faulkner watercolors the family commissioned of the garden. And we do know the name of at least one of the Rings gardeners. It was Mr. Mulligan, shown here amidst his handiwork. And one of the things that I've just seen, the Garrett family has preserved and has returned to Saginaw, and I just saw it last week for the first time, Mrs. Ring's garden journal, I'll call it, or garden notebook, which is something that I've just gone through once very quickly and made a few things. And it's easy to think that Mrs. Ring was, simply commissioned a garden and never looked, other than enjoying it, never had any involvement with it. And the amount of involvement in it is really quite amazing, and the amount of information in this book is amazing. And I've included a few photographs, but just to share them, I have not had a chance to read it completely even. However, we do know that the family were passionate gardeners. I know her daughter, Elizabeth Ring Mather, her granddaughter remembered her grandmother pushing her through their former garden. But this book tells the story of the garden. The book is started in 1906. The garden of Elizabeth Ring begun in the fall of 1904. Landscape architect Charles A. Platt moved into the new home on June 15th, 1905, the 20th anniversary of Jessie Ring's birth. Mrs. Garrett is Jessie Ring. So on the 15th of June, 1905, they moved into their new home. And these planting, this is for, and it's broken down just like the original planting schedule is. Here is just in the center beds, plaque halls for using a form of hosta, and this even gives the dates that they bloomed that year. It also, the book really puts us in touch with another really renowned gardener, the garden author of Louisa Yeoman King. She's better known as Mrs. Frances King. She was an avid garden author, a founder of the Women's National Farm and Garden Association. Actually, for a long time, the local chapter in fact, the national chapter included her name as the first president. I knew that she was a friend of the Rings, and this becomes difficult because you say Ring and King in the same sentence, so you'll have to excuse me. But, and I knew how I became first aware of Mrs. King was back in the 90s. Mrs. Ireland, who would be the Rings' grandson's wife, had told us that this book was published in Mrs. King's books. And at that time, I did find a mention at that time where she describes the center beds and she describes how effective it is. However, recently, I found a lot more, and I'm going to kind of do this out of order. But in the book, there are various flower photographs, but there is actually a pressing that must have been from a blossom that must have been given to Mrs. Ring by Mrs. Frances King or Louisa Boyd King. And it's a pressed cowslip, whether Miss is, and I had found another mention of this garden in one of Mrs. King's book. These are some examples of her books. This is her home in Elma, where she had an extensive formal garden, which has not fared as well as ours. It's simply a parking lot now where her garden stood. But in her book, The Small Garden, she describes the use of marble benches in this garden. And it's so interesting because what she does, she describes the benches, but then why one should not use marble benches, but then she describes why they're appropriate for use in this garden. So that's a photograph. And it's just really wonderful to see how Mrs. Ring, over time, working with her garden, increased the plantings. And this is the original planting list for 1905. And this is directly from Platt's planting schedule, the one that we had worked with in the 80s and 90s. This is Festiva Maxima Peonies, Madame Chirot Iris. Those were two of the plants, but those are all of the plants that are on Platt's list. But then she goes on to do how she changed it in 1906. And then she describes adding gladiolas. And it's just really fun to see each year how she adds and enriches it. This is Mrs. Ring, about 19. This is painted by Irving and Ramsey Wiles after her passing. One of the things that is constant in the garden are the anemones, which are in the center beds. The house was included in Platt's monograph, which was published in 1912. Kind of a fun thing in the monograph, if you look carefully at the photograph, you'll see the garden, but then you can see when on the front facade, originally the porch was open, but then the family had it glassed in a few years later, within the first 5-6 years after the house was completed. And it's interesting that Platt in his monograph, the house, it's a glorious room inside, but it kind of altered the front facade, probably in a way that he didn't find as strong as the original design. So he had it both ways. and included the front facade before the porch was enclosed. Mrs. Ring's brother, Richard D. Merrill, also engaged Platt to design his home in Seattle, as did his daughter's family, the Garrett family. And then Mrs. Ring, Elizabeth Ring Mather, one of the Ring's daughter, would marry William G. Mather of Bracknell, outside of Cleveland, who had earlier, before their marriage, commissioned a huge Platt estate called Gwynn. So the family really did stay very committed to Platt, and we'll see in a few seconds even more. This is looking towards the wild garden. Originally there were 7 Lombardy poplars planted behind the Esedra. You can see that the one thing, the row of willows, behind the row of willows, Mr. Ring, sometime very early in the history of the garden, felt comfortable developing that area into a wild garden. But even here, the geometry, and we don't know that this is by Platt, but the geometry of the formal garden is continued. When you look closely at the photograph, on the main axis, that bed is split between ferns and daylilies, and it's on line with one of the doors in the dining room. He carries that line out into the garden, and there's a stone that the fake stream started, and there's a faucet right in line with it too, so you can turn it on and off. This is just looking out into the wild garden. This is a fairly late photograph in the wild garden. Throughout the garden, there were plotted plants used to really, just to add spots of color. And you can see the terracotta pots, which interestingly enough aren't always from Italy, as one might think, that he was in, because a lot of the furniture was imported. It was a Philadelphia company that advertised that they supplied pots for many of Mr. Platt's garden. These are photographs taken in the Castle Museum's collection. These were taken by the garden department, a member of the garden department of the Saginaw Women's Club, for a lecture. And these capture the garden in the 1920s. And by the 20s, things were changing a bit, and certainly the pruning in the garden was changing. Mr. Ring died in 1933, and the home was sold in 1936. At that time, the second owners of the home retained the garden, but you can see it's very different than it had been during the Ring's time here, and I'm not quite certain what went with the irises at other times of year. And this is the garden in 1947. This is what it looked like when the house was repurchased by Jessie Garrett and Elizabeth Ring Ireland, and given to the people of Saginaw for a museum. And this is what the garden looked like at that time. This is what it looked like in the 50s when they did a foreign film series in the garden. In the late 1950s, it was redone as a green garden. And I'm going to jump ahead here because I'm running out of time, but I did want to note, this is the Rings Monument in Oakwood Cemetery. Does the design of it look familiar at all? It's actually designed by Charles Adams Platt. And there's several clients that he commissioned monuments from him, and the Rings were one of those. So, I mean, they remain very committed to their architect. And, it's a garden that's continued to live for a very long time. And I wanted to close with one thing from the garden book. Mrs. Ring died in December of 1912. She was in New York, became severely ill, and did not make it back to Saginaw. But this is her notes for the autumn of 1912. And she's planting, and these probably were planted, she's planting scilla and jonquils on the slopes amongst the roses and spirea. And then she comments that they should be positioned so they're visible from the house. So the main emphasis are the ones by the pavilion. The pencil dots are the ones that are already there in 1912. The ink dots are the ones she put in. And if I'm reading the number right, she's putting in 2,000 bulbs that fall. I know I try to put in a couple hundred daffodils each fall, not 2,000. So she never saw it bloom, but it is interesting. It's easy to think that the story of the garden ends, but gardens, the structure of the garden, as we've seen right at the beginning, is still very intact, really has shaped the use of the property for I still haven't done my math because I've been talking over 80, almost 90 years, I think we're now at. And the Ring story wasn't completely, and is certainly not over either. Although many of the families left and the business had branched out by the time Mr. Ring, actually by the time Mrs. Ring passed away in 1912, the lumber boom in Saginaw was long gone. However, the company that was started in Saginaw in various iterations went to the West Coast. Here's in Archives West, the Maryland Ring Lumber Company archives. And actually, when I've looked at the finding aid, some of the records from Saginaw ended up relating to this house there. And actually, Maryland Ring, the lumber company, still exists today. And this is their website. So with that, what we'll do is go outdoors, and I'm glad to answer any questions that I'm able to, and thank you. I was saying about the structure of the garden and the house, and when Platt talked about that organization of an Italian villa, you've seen we have the house, we have the grass terrace, we have the formal garden, or the flower garden, the water feature, which isn't huge, but it is indeed a water feature. And then there was a stream in the back, of course, and then the bosco, or the woodland, behind it. And this isn't a huge space. It is a huge space for those who are charged with weeding it or pruning the hedges, but it is really not a large space. And yet it feels incredibly expansive, actually. It was a very controlled space. It certainly must have been a site that Platt did not find as accommodating, especially to some of the later great estates he would create, or even in his own home in Cornish, New Hampshire, where he really could control everything. But he didn't wimp out and just do a little project. He was able to really create that confined space. The new additions were designed really to tie into that original planning. Actually, one of Platt's grandsons was a principal in the firm that designed them. And you can see how they do really reflect that connect to the original organization. So the original property line is the back wall of the pavilion on the south. On the north, the 1904 property line is probably about 15 feet beyond where the column is there. Then in 1920, in the mid-20s, I think it's 26, Ring was able to purchase the adjoining house, had it removed, and he constructed a garage that was only parts of existed when the new wing was constructed. The Rings did own considerable kind of contiguous property that was on the northeast and then behind the wild garden. And Mrs. Ring does talk in her garden journal about using cold frames and other plantings, and those would have been in those other areas. Then later on, as Saginaw's transitioned from from a lumbering center into an industrial center. Mr. Ring acquired the property on the other side of the railroad track, and eventually it became a field that was used by some of the by St. Andrew's High School. But at one point he talks about how the newspaper reports, and it doesn't appear that anything was done with it, but that he's bringing his New York architect in to look for the property, to look at the property to create something, but it doesn't look like anything ever transpired. There's no record in Platt's records or in further newspaper accounts. As I said, the family stayed incredibly committed to using Platt. We know even for Jesse Garrett's wedding, Platt was brought in to design benches that converted the south porch into a wedding chapel. And the newspaper comments that their New York, I think it calls it their New York architect, had loaned antique tapestry that was hung on the Michigan Avenue side, and those were reused. Boy, this is a very dangerous piece of equipment. I apologize. And the colors that were used throughout the garden and the house, really, as I said, were consistent. So if you look really carefully at this wall of the steps, you can see where there is kind of a yellowish color, still very faded and soiled, but still remaining. All the concrete at one time had that coating on, and that's very closely, if not identical, to the original ceiling color that was used throughout the house. And then the white color that was used throughout the house and garden were all the same thing. And when I used to volunteer here, sometimes at the front desk in the 90s, sometimes people would come in and they'd say, it's so sad that somebody painted all this beautiful woodwork. The woodwork was painted from the beginning. According to family tradition, it was 7 coats rubbed out. When we had the paint analyzed, it was actually 3, but it was an almost glass-like finish, just really beautifully applied, and it really wouldn't have been repainted probably in all the time Mr. Ring was here. And then the spaces that did have oak woodwork, anybody want to take a guess? The servants' quarters in the kitchen and some of the service rooms. The dining room paneling was butternut. That was part of the contract. I've read the painting specifications. The dining room paneling was finished by a firm from New York, and originally it was a wax finish, and there just used to be some places it's been painted, stripped, repainted, but you could find just a couple of places, and it was what I would call a dead brown. There's not a lot of red in it. And then picture that. And one of the things, this house had electricity right from the start. Actually, in the wild garden, you can see there were light bulbs strung, which seemed so odd in the 1990s when we were working on it. Now they're the type of thing you can buy faux LED carbon filament bulbs. But in this house, there was electricity, no gas fixtures that we found any. It's not in the plans. Or in any of the photographs, but there was one place that didn't have an electric fixture. Anybody want to take a guess where it might have been? No, it was over the dining room table. There were 2 electric sconces in the dining room. They were on the west wall, and those would have allowed the servants to see when they would have allowed the servants to carry food in by light, but then the family itself would have dined by candlelight. They made that commitment, and that wasn't always typical of Platt's work. You can see that there were electric fixtures in a lot of them, but the dining room was the one place over the dining room table where there was very minimal electricity in the dining room. This was the breakfast porch on the north side. Mr. Ring was committed to his was an avid hunter, passionate about his dogs, and his dogs actually have tombstones on the terrace. One of the things that, if with historic landscapes, that this is a lovely lawn, but historic lawns would not have been all grass like this. I mean, you would have, the gardener would have weeded it out, but it would have been a mixture of grass and clover. So it's a very, if you look at the photographs, it's very different in texture. The original pruning for the garden was very interesting, that the formal beds are very manicured in the photographs, and the hedges, the barberry hedges were originally about, I think it's 18 inches is what they're supposed to be at, which is almost impossible to keep them at. And then the flowers are taller, and they're kept very, very manicured. But then the Rosa lucida and Rosa virginiana that was on the slopes was allowed to become much more naturalistic, and they were just cut at a straight line at the top of the hedge and the back. Of course, they were well weeded, which is impossible without having a gardener. And then on this side and that side, where the fences are, those were kind of banks of various types of shrubbery. So they kind of gave an uneven appearance. But then in the wild garden, he goes back to, or the Ring family decides that the willow trees actually become a hedge, really becoming a straight line. I have seen a family snapshot where the willow trees, it's in the winter, and you can see the prune line on the willow trees, but you can also see the photograph of the smokestacks in some of the factories that are down by the river projecting above. So the illusion was, I know when you're in this garden, one of the things that really shattered, in a wonderful sort of way, reminds you that this is an illusion, is when a train goes by, because everything will shake. And actually, originally, there would have been far more trains than there are today. But I know I've been in the garden at night when everything's very quiet, and all of a sudden, everything starts to shake and the train plants. And you realize when you go in the wild garden, it's an angled piece of property, and the train comes fairly close. After the house was closed, the plat furnishings and the things were removed by the two children, or divided. Well, there were three children, and they were divided. Some of them were moved to Gwynn in Cleveland, and at Gwynn, there's two statues. There was a statue of a bust of Janus, and then just a fragment of Roman sculpture. It was a Capitol. Those were positioned at Gwynn on either side of the pavilion, kind of a memory of what the house in Saginaw had, and they fit into the new landscape perfectly. And the Garretts had a plant-designed home, is my understanding, and the benches were positioned on their terrace in a similar position. So, are there questions? I think I've talked enough.
Question?
Yes.
Is any of the greenery, the landscaping, original?
I used to think that the barberry hedges and Platt used, however, they were mostly replanted in '47. I found records afterwards. They are early, but there isn't. Much of it's the correct type of the greenery, but the hedges were replanted by a Boy Scout troop in the '40s. So no, they're not. I'm trying to think of anything.
None of the roses.
No, the roses. No. And 120 years is a long time. When I worked on the garden in the 90s, we did have one original apple tree. It was 3/4 dead, and we were going to take a graft the next year, and it toppled in a storm. These are period apple trees, and but you can't replace what was a mature apple tree. And one of the challenges of a landscape is just that layering of history. And it's really fun when you look at that 19 of the photographs that were sent to Platt. The photographs of the Ring's garden before this one was planned. It's interesting how just those trees are really the only thing that survived, but they definitely impart an influence on it.